Well, I guess we'll get started. This isn't going to take the usual amount of time because, as you can tell, you got the second string tonight. And Mary Lou helped me with this when she said, we need to do something for tomorrow night. What do you suggest? And I gave her the deer in the headlights look. And I said, well, I'll come up with something. And she suggested maybe make it current and relevant in today's world, which has to do with what's going on right now in the East. So we're going to do a little history and a little bit of how do we get from there to here. Now, I didn't make any handouts because this will be a little bit of an open discussion once we get started here. But I do have a map of Israel that we're going to show that somewhat defines the segments of that country that are causing the social, political, and religious split and how it got to this point. So as you know, one of the main groups that are in the forefront of the news is a group called the Hamas. Does anybody really know what the Hamas is, or the Hamas? Well, they've been labeled terrorists because of their recent actions, and I suppose they fit into that category, but they're not the only extreme religious organization that fits in the terrorist category. And of course, as you know, other than Iran, the lion's share of those terrorist organizations originated in the East. And they've got long-standing generational histories that have brought them to this point. But essentially, Hamas was founded in 1987. And it was during an uprising against the Israeli occupation of Gaza and the West Bank. They were getting irritated by what they referred to as an infringement. Now, there is a difference between occupation and control, or occupation and administration, or even the term settlement. It's kind of like you own a house and somebody decides to move in as a squatter. They are taking possession of it and they have assumed certain rights because they're there. And it's not like the current term of the rights of adverse possession where you can stay someplace for so long or have an incorrect property line for so long, and if it goes undisputed, it stays like that. That isn't exactly what happens, but historically, that can happen when one group moves in with another group under the premise of saying, well, let's see if we can cohabitate on a friendly basis. And it may start that way until all of a sudden it isn't friendly anymore. That's kind of what happened over in the East. Now, the Hamas originally was a branch of what was affectionately called the Muslim Brotherhood. And that was an Islamist political and social movement that essentially originated in Egypt. And as you know, Egypt has a long Arab history, and they were not necessarily friends of Israel all the time, and they're a significant force in the Middle East. But Hamas has since distanced themselves from the Brotherhood. They no longer necessarily align with that. And as a result, they cite the rationale being that Israel had provided economic incentives to the Gazan workers in what is currently referred to as the Gaza Strip. But Hamas maintained control over it. Hamas currently considers themselves part of the Palestinian sect. So if somebody were to say, define Palestinian, well, it's somebody that is from Palestine. Really? And where is that? Well, that's when it gets kind of complicated, because Israel is roughly the size of New Jersey. And the Gaza Strip is about the size of Delaware. Combined, they're roughly the size of the state of Hawaii or the Philippines. But they have a significant population. And the population is made up of Islamic, and Muslim, Christian, especially when you start talking about Old Jerusalem, which is East Jerusalem, which is near the eastern edge of Israel. Now, East Jerusalem is not defined in the same manner today as West Jerusalem, even though Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. A lot of people, when they want to go to Jerusalem for a group trip to get a historical knowledge of what it's all about, they wind up in East Jerusalem. Now that's right next door to Syria. And Syria's been in the news as well. But today, as you all define, Hamas is defined as a Palestinian militant organization. And they're clinging to that title. Rightly or wrongly, that's what they have aligned with. Now, in East Jerusalem, there is a long simmering dispute over what's called Al-Aqsa Mosque. And that mosque is large. It's roughly the size of a couple of football fields, but it's sacred to both Muslims and Jews. And it has been for a long time. But they have competing claims over the site as to just who it belongs to. The site known to the Jews is referred to as Temple Mount. And to the Muslim, it's Al-Haram al-Sharif. It's not exactly under one roof, but it's close. And they don't mind the differences, but they very vehemently mind too many of one side or the other being in that location at the same time. If a lot of Israelis or people of the Jewish sect or whatever start showing up, the Muslims interpret that as another attempt to occupy. And then they point to all of the shenanigans that were done in the past as another example of how infringement is allowed to occur and how it starts. Now, in recent years, Israeli religious nationalists have increased their visits to the compound. And of course, last week, as we know, hundreds of ultra-Orthodox Jews visited the site during the Jewish Harvest Festival in Sukkot. That wasn't a surprise. That's pretty much an annual event. That's one of the, I'll say, the major concerns right now is if the United States relies on Israel for intel about potential militant uprisings. Were they asleep at the switch? They didn't say they had a concern about some of these events, even that music festival that was only 15 miles from Gaza. They didn't even whisper to the U.S., you know, we may have a problem here. So now the finger pointing begins. Well, we need U.S. support. Well, yeah, you do, but what kind of support do you expect now after the fact? We're not going to point any guns at anybody. We'll probably drop a lot of armament off of a train car or an airplane in your lap and you can use it however you see fit, but really, does that solve a problem? So the Hamas condemned the action accusing the Jews of praying in the Al-Aqsa Mosque in violation of what they referred to as the status quo. That's just one reason why the Hamas is getting all wound around the axle. It's because of what's happening in an area that they consider part of Palestine, but it's a long way from the Gaza Strip. So the Hamas cited the expansion of Jewish settlements on lands in the Palestinian claim for future state and tighter restrictions on the Palestinian prisoners in Israel. So the Palestinians will say, you know, it was our intent to try to find a location or locations that we could call our own, where we could live without threat or without restriction. Oh, by the way, restrictions, as you talk about passports and going from one area to the other, if you're a Palestinian, you're pretty well locked in. You're not even welcome in Egypt. And they said, you know, we just keep getting strangled here. Well, In negotiations with Qatar, Egypt, and the United Nations, the Hamas pushed for Israeli concessions that could loosen what was then a 17-year blockade on an enclave and to help halt the worsening financial crisis. There are a lot of ways that you can make life very difficult for somebody other than shutting off their water, pushing them to an area where crops don't grow very well. You can also financially strangle them. There's many subtle and not so subtle ways you can make life rough for people with the pretense of hoping they might just decide they've had enough and they'll just kind of wander away. And then you can just move in and do what you want. But right now, this is also happening at a time when Benjamin Netanyahu has a proposal to weaken the Supreme Court in Israel at a time when he's on trial for corruption. Now, the Israeli media, in some factions, they're starting to side with the Palestinian argument. Likewise, in some of the Palestinian areas, the social media is starting to take sides with Israel. So it's kind of like being in the US and you got one group that likes this and one group that likes that, and they should all be united as Americans in support of the US, but they're more than willing to take up a banner and hold a fight for somebody that's on the other side of the planet. But since they can't go there and fight, they'll fight among each other here and stir things up. And they'll look for allies. Is it going to be the media, the mainstream media? Is it going to be the social media? How are you going to whip that into a frenzy to kind of just get your point across? Well, in Israel, this is all happening at a time when Netanyahu is not quite as influential as he'd like to be, and if he is influential, it's kind of for the wrong reason. But the protests there in the big cities of Israel are saying, you know, this is just another example of Netanyahu's attempt to get a power grab. And that's the very thing he's being accused of by the Palestinians. They said that's just an example of his motive. He just never is satisfied. He never has enough. And what he usually wants, we think, belongs to us. So it's causing a bitterly divided society. And there's even turmoil now within the Israeli military. They rely heavily on reservists or a volunteer component to the military. Now, some of them are saying, you know, I don't know if I really want to join this fight. And others say, where do I sign up right now? So there's a division even in the military. But it will make a dent in somebody's effectiveness if they stop volunteering for duty or don't show up. Let's back the clock up a little bit and say, okay, enough about today. When did the world become aware, the modern world, let's talk about the 20th century, of the situation that took place in Israel? Well, after World War II, in 1947, the UN, United Nations, proposed partitioning Palestine, or what was then defined as Palestine, into two independent states. One was the Palestinian Arab group, and the other was the Jewish group, and Jerusalem at that time was nationalized. So one of the two envisioned states proclaimed its independence as Israel, and in the 1948, 1 year later, war involving neighboring Arab states, it expanded to 77% of the territory that was mandated as Palestine. Now that's when what we refer to as Palestine, or even in parts of Israel, or the West Bank, or Gaza, were under British rule, or British administration might be a better term. Britain really never had control of it. They couldn't get their arms around it no matter what kind of suggestions they made. But it did include a larger part of Jerusalem, and so that particular war that started in 1948 wound up driving almost 750,000 Palestinians out of the area, which meant they were driven from their homes. And many of them ended up in Gaza, the West Bank, or, oh yeah, East Jerusalem. That's where they went. So you can understand why they kind of hold that area dear now. Fast forward more. They decided they needed some place where they could sit and at the same time garner international support, even from unfriendly nations, at least to the point where they could say, let's just take a deep breath. We're here, you're there. We know we have differences. Let's see if we can figure out a way to come to a resolution that'll at least for the moment stop the overt belligerence or condescending attempts to make life difficult for a small part of the population. That same year, 1948, Israel's founding father, which is David Ben-Gurion, proclaimed the modern state of Israel on May 14th of 1948 in an attempt to establish a safe haven for Jews. Now Jews, I didn't say Palestinians, Jews that were fleeing persecution. And they were seeking a national home on land that they felt, the Jews felt they had long-standing generational ties to. So how far back do you want to go? Long ways. But since that time, the occupied Palestinian territories have been under Israeli military control. Israel had a pretty strong hold on things after Israel was formally recognized as a state. And those segmented territories of Gaza, West Bank, and Jerusalem were all considered under Israeli military control. I mean, if you were a downtrodden society and you were just lucky to find a place where you could put up a tent, you obviously aren't going to have a very strong military. And the Palestinians didn't have a strong military. Not then. Well, they still really don't, but they're relying on another or a couple other extremist nations for their support, just like a lot of terrorist groups have, whether it's Al-Qaeda or you name it. They find somebody who will back them. But in 1967, there was a 6-day war. I don't know if anybody remembers that. That's the year I graduated from high school. Israel occupied the territories of Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, which was subsequently annexed by Israel. There's that word annex. Isn't that kind of like what Russia's trying to do with Crimea and Ukraine? Well, we're just going to annex it. You're just going to become part of us. You won't mind, will you? We're not going to do anything nasty. We're just going to say, now you're in our border. And life will go on. But it doesn't. Not even no matter what UN resolution is put forth. So this brought about a second exodus of Palestinians, another 500,000, and a UN Security Council resolution number 242 in 1967 formulated the principles of a just and lasting peace, including an Israeli withdrawal from territories occupied in the conflict, a just settlement of refugees' problems, and the termination of all claims and states of belligerency. So you can just tell that resolution was aimed right square at Israel, saying, cease and desist. Pretty clear. UN Security Council resolution, recognized worldwide, at least in the free world. Well, since that time, the occupied Palestinian territories have been under Israeli military control, and this makes it the longest occupation in modern history of any civilization. Notice I said occupation. where they came, they're here, we don't want them here, they're not leaving. They're still here. No matter what they say their pretense is. So these territories, Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, are becoming progressively more segmented. Now, Israeli settlements. I always like to define a settlement. It's probably the first step in becoming an occupation. Well, we're here. We're dirt poor just like you are. We're going to have to try to find a way to make a living just like you do. We're in the same boat. No, you're not. You got the backing of the Israeli government. We don't. You can call it what you want, settlement or whatever, but we know why you're here. Right now, there are over 250 Jewish settlements in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. 250. Now, I'm going to make reference to this map. I don't know how well you can see it. This little area right here is called the Gaza Strip. That dotted line represents the boundaries. The West Bank starts right about here and goes just like this. So you can tell, if I can point it out, that's not as clear as I would have liked it.
I wonder if we should shut the light off so we can see better.
Just turn the front two off.
Yeah.
Yeah, the West Bank's in blue.
Okay. Well, here's Jerusalem right here. And so when you talk about East Jerusalem, you're talking about the area from here over to the eastern border of what's now considered Israel with Jordan by the Dead Sea. So for the purpose of this conversation, if we're going to talk about Gaza and the West Bank, and we can leave East Jerusalem out of the conversation simply because it's not as definable, this is where the uprising started right here. And this is the little town where the music festival was taking place. But the West Bank still represents a sizable population of Palestinians. Now, currently, Israel and Egypt are on good speaking terms. Israel and Jordan, I suppose you could say it's simmering, but it's not anywhere near a boiling point. Syria and Lebanon, well, they've been in the news recently too. You can't see Qatar on here. They're part of the program. You can't see Iran. But what you can gather from all of this, this is a part of the world that has been embroiled for a long, long time, and there have been numerous international attempts to stop it, and none of them have worked. The Israeli settlements that I mentioned a minute ago, those are currently considered illegal under international law. It is strictly prohibited as they violate the Fourth Geneva Convention, which clearly prohibits an occupying power from transferring its population to the area that it occupies. So what that's essentially saying is you can't simply create a settlement and say, as a result of the number of settlements we have, we currently occupy this space. So we're going to start transferring our citizens to this area to grow it. Now, if it grows big enough, then we can say, oh, now our country has governing control over this. And oh, as a result of that, we're going to redefine the border. And that's where the headaches start. So believe it or not, in 2019, under President Donald Trump, the U.S. declared that Israeli settlements on occupied Palestinian land were not necessarily illegal, regardless of what the Fourth Geneva Convention said years ago that all nations in the free world agreed to. He just said, well, you know, Israel, they're not really doing such a bad thing. Well, you can imagine how that was interpreted by the other side. So today the term Palestinian refers to Arabs of the mandated Palestine location, excluding Israel. So whatever area you currently define as being mandated by all the resolutions and international agreements that are considered Palestine, anybody that is of Arab descent that lives in those areas is considered Palestinian. Now, although the Arabs of Palestine have been creating and developing a Palestinian identity for over 200 years, the idea that Palestinians form a distinct people is relatively recent. Until the establishment of Israel in 1947, the Palestinian was used by Jews and foreigners to describe the inhabitants of Palestine and had only begun to be used by the Arabs themselves at the turn of the 20th century. So the Jews had a clear definition of what a Palestinian was, but the Arabs that were in Palestinian territory living there, claiming it was theirs, they didn't call themselves Palestinians until early 1900s. So today's Palestinians were essentially organized in Syria and the deserts of Arabia. They have no historical bond to the land promised by God to the children of Israel. So if you want to go all the way back to the beginning, even the Muslim Quran decreed that God gave Israel to the Jews. That was pretty clear, and it was pretty clear to the Muslims and the Christians, and the Jews, of course. Unlike early Jewish ancestors who were commanded to make no treaties with the enemy. Remember David and Saul and how upset Saul was when they killed off all the enemies except for one king, and they wanted to use him for public display, and Saul got so irritated he said, I told you to eliminate everyone. Every enemy you were directly, expressly told to eliminate them. Not make friends with them. Well, unlike Jewish ancestors who were commanded to make no treaties with the enemy, present-day Israel signed peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan. And they have largely stuck. And if that isn't proof enough, the old city, which is located in East Jerusalem, is home to one of the holiest sites in Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. I made reference to that before about going there as a historical site. In 1981, it was designated as a World Heritage Site by the United Nations. And it's recognized to be that way even today. So now, with all of this being said, with this map, Jordan and Egypt are pretty much out of this game. It's within this borderline right here that is affectionately referred to as Israel. And the fighting is limited to this area right here. Now, if that's roughly the size of Delaware, then I would suspect that this area right here would probably be I'm thinking in terms of counties, which is something we kind of recognize in our states. But this whole mess is about a third the size of Missouri. So it's almost like 3 counties fighting 3 other counties. But look what's happening. They're not just going over to another county with baseball bats and clubs. They're lobbying hundreds of missiles at nighttime. They're going after civilians. They're taking hostages. They're making demands. Now, when the pressure cooker lid gets put on something so long, can you really be surprised when the lid flies off and someone says, we don't really care anymore. We're just done. And we're going to take the most extreme actions we can think of to get somebody's attention because this is not working. We've tried it your way. We've listened to your resolution. We've talked about your support. We know who hates them. Where do we fit in all this? So if you are a member of the Palestinian Society and you've maybe gone through a couple of generations of this or more, how many generations are there between now and the beginning of the 20th century? 6? And if from your perspective and your family's perspective, everything has worsened, what kind of solution do you see to this? What does the rest of the world have as an option to make this go away? So, the only reason I put some of this out there is I hate it when the mainstream media embeds somebody in the battleground. There are a couple of foreign correspondents that do a pretty good job, but the U.S. media, they just ask some of the dumbest questions. They'll pick people out of nowhere that have had family members kidnapped and say, well, how does that make you feel today? I just want to slap them upside the head. And they think that's competent reporting of an event.
When this has been going on for thousands of years.
It has.
You cannot calm it in just a matter of months. I made 3 trips to the Holy Land, and each time I saw the persecution going on. But in reverse, I also saw, where the temple is, the Muslim temple, which is in Jerusalem, that sits on top of where the Jewish temple was. There were 2 Jewish temples, and both were destroyed. They created that Muslim temple there. We were walking around to head to the eastern gate because we wanted to see where Jesus was going to return, although it's gated up. We were walking along the edge of the Muslim temple, and I had my Bible in my arm. This guy charged down out of the steps of the Muslim temple and accosted me. And I said, okay, I'll go back. You guys, I'll meet you another place. Our guide lit into him like I'd never seen anybody yell at another person before. And he backed off, and we quickly went on around. But, it's burning. It's there. It's distasteful.
Yeah, and you can imagine why this is continuing. Look at how long it took this country to get over the Civil War.
Yeah.
That was multi-generational. That was 160 years ago. We don't talk about it too much, and we don't have too many overt examples of hostilities towards the North or the South by the other, but what would it have been like if the Civil War had gone on for 1,800 years? My gosh, that event has now become part of your personal heritage. It's not just a Hatfields and McCoys thing anymore. And I'm afraid that this country is probably going to make it even worse because whatever we do is going to have a political motivation. And I don't think anything good ever came out of that. So, what do you think would happen if the United Nations and our allies and the US and everybody just said, we're gonna take one step back, and we're just gonna wait and let this play itself out for a while, and then we're gonna see if there's any type of a solution. And I hate to use the term permanent solution because that probably doesn't exist, but if there's any kind of remedy to this current mess, not that it's gonna be a long-standing remedy, but when you start talking about a country like ours that is currently faced with a $3 trillion debt, and how many billions of dollars are we throwing at the Ukraine to help them? Are we doing this just to say it's one way to keep the mess out of our backyard? Well, until 9/11, our backyard had never really been threatened. Jim?
I think there are two additional points to be made. As I understand it anecdotally, the Palestinian Constitution, assuming that's correct, incorporates language about the destruction of Israel. And that's their main purpose. And I think that's one of the main drivers in a lot of the things that have happened. A little while ago was human bombs. They put that, and then they went to rockets because they got some help with the metalwork and whatnot. Secondly, a while back, I think it was Ariel Sharon, and I believe he was the one, and Arafat went all the way down the road to a deal, two-state solution, and Arafat backed out of it. He sabotaged his own country. So they did have the opportunity to come to an agreement. Apparently it was a good one. It was a Camp David thing, I recall. And the fact that they had that in the Constitution, I mean, the analogy to me is, I have snakes in my backyard in the springtime, all kinds of snakes. Okay, I have fences up, I have dogs and everything else. If you have things like that, you have to defend yourself against it. You can't just open the back door and let them come in overnight, wind up under your bed. I mean, so what, you say back off from Israel. I mean, Israel has been backing off. They've been more than patient, backing off and backing off and backing off, showing restraint. They get rockets fired over there. They'll drop a couple bombs in a little neighborhood and wipe somebody else out. But, it comes a time. I think it reminds me of raising dogs or raising kids. You can be patient with your children. I raise children. And they get to the point where they push and push and push, then they're going to get a spanking. And that's come to the head right now. I mean, all the brutality over there, cutting heads off babies and everything else, I mean, that's inexcusable. And when it's said that they're going to wipe Hamas out, I hope they do take it down to the ground.
Well, there's no doubt that it's going to get ugly. And I suppose you could say, well, Moses was charged with delivering people out of Egypt. Is somebody going to come and deliver the Palestinians out of Israel? Wes?
There will be a solution. There will be a peaceful solution. You study prophecy, that's what the Antichrist does.
Mm-hmm.
That's when it happens. And when that happens, you know that's the guy. Because that's how he'll get the whole world behind him. But it's a false promise. But they'll have, you've been listening to Pastor Tony's prophecy teachings, they'll have peace for like 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And all babies will break loose after that. But I mean, that's kind of unfortunately, that's your bell tower. There is something else though that maybe's in the background that people may not realize, and that is there's a peace accord with, I think, Saudi Arabia and some of the other Gulf states are in process of making a peace accord with that. Iran hates them as much as they hate Israel, and some people say is very much something to create a division in that happening, because Iran knows that if they have a peace accord together, then you have a united front against Iran.
Mm-hmm.
And Iran doesn't want any part of that. So there's a lot of outside things happen in here that people don't see from foreign countries. And, there's been bad stuff on both sides, but in Israel, if you're an Arab, you can live in the country of Israel, and you can vote, and you can do all that kind of stuff. Opposite? No. So, kind of, when you're weighing your balances there, you got to look at that. Now, settlements and stuff like that, yeah, that's, I mean, that's, there's give and take. But there's the solution will come, and when it does, lift up your head, because that's your sign. And it will come. Unfortunately,
yeah, there are a lot of indications that some of the predictions made in the Bible are being revealed today with vivid examples. If you want to talk about the rapture, the tribulation, there is no preeminent event that has to happen before that. That's going to happen. And leading up to that, we're seeing some of the things that have been forecasted in the Bible. There are a few examples out there that say, they said this would be part of it. And, I'm going to start a Bible study tomorrow morning on cultures and conflict. And it's geared mainly toward Christianity, of course. But I don't know when I first really became consciously aware of the fact that Christianity is under attack. But as I think about it, it was a long time ago. I just didn't recognize it. I thought it was an isolated event here and an isolated event there, but it's not. There is a deliberate and well-established movement out there to push Christianity aside entirely. And it's not just hostile nations, it's right here. It is right here. And I remember 14 years ago, we came down here, some friends of ours from Dubuque, Iowa, and Rosemary and I rode our motorcycles down here, and we went to see the show 6. And it was so nice to be in there because it was so flippin' hot coming down on those bikes, and I got something in my eye and I couldn't flush it out. Well, anyway, throughout the course of the show, they showed that video about their family and their mom, and I started to tear up and it washed that whatever it was right out of my eye. But they said the reason they got their career started in Las Vegas is because that was an opportunity. The reason they left Las Vegas and moved here was because they didn't have to be ashamed to admit they were Christian in Branson, Missouri. It wasn't like that in Las Vegas. Now, you can point to Las Vegas. That's not a good example of any representation in the U.S., but that was 14 or 15 years ago. And I didn't even think about it so much, but yeah. Remember when it became popular to put "In God We Trust" on your car? How many of those stickers do you see anymore? I've still got it on my truck. On one side of the back window, and on the other side of the back window it says U.S. Coast Guard. I don't know of anybody growling about that. But, anyway, just thought we would bring this out for a little conversation. I appreciate the input. I know we're all saddened by what we see, and we all really hope that doesn't create unnecessary angst over here. We got enough of our own problems to deal with, but coming and gathering with a group like this, occasionally, Wednesday night, Sunday morning, or whatever, is my way of setting aside all of the noise and the negative influence on the outside and lets me hear that one quiet voice that says, I'm still here. I gave you that example. I can take that home because I just got reminded from all of you. It restores your faith. But anyway, I think some folks have to go. Does Tony normally conclude this with a prayer?
Yes, let's do it, no matter what. Let's do it.
Let's do what?
My prayer. Les?
I'm gonna ask Wes to do it, but the bigger question is, and maybe Wes can weigh in on this, because Tony is gonna be laying low for at least a couple of weeks, the question became, since you got the second string tonight, and Lord knows what'll happen next week, but